Now, William Sakwa, as I said, is a Pan-African, a contributor for African Stream, and a man who knows his onions so far as Mali is concerned. I want to talk first, William, about Mali, but we'll broaden it, I'm sure, to the question of colonialism in Africa and the need for Pan-Africanism. But let's start with Mali, may we? It's a very significant development that Mali has booted out what Fidel called the Trojan horses of the NGO industry. How did all that come about?
So the problem with the NGOs in Mali was that they're not really non-governmental organizations. And what led to them being kicked out in the first place was the fact that France withdrew its assistance to Mali following the coup d'etat that was itself sparked by the government's failure to deal with the terrorist problem created by France itself. Yeah.
Well, I talked earlier in my introduction about the triptych of the economic hitmen, the jackals that do the dirty work if the economic hitmen can't get you, and ultimately the army if the jackals can't do the job. Mali has suffered all three, hasn't it?
It really has. It really has. And I think what's even what's most interesting about this whole debacle is that the problems originate from France. Mali suffers a terrorist problem that was created when France invaded Libya to depose Gaddafi and led to creation of slave markets in what was once Africa's wealthiest state. So, I mean, after Gaddafi's ouster, we have all these groups trickling back down the Sahel that led to the rise of jihadism across the Sahel region. And then you have allegations of France itself supporting the problems he created. We saw during one of the Mali officials called for a UN Security Council meeting to discuss France's assistance to the terrorist groups in Mali itself. So, yeah, there's a very clear line drawing France to the problems in Mali, be it economically through ECOWAS. We saw after the coup happened, France used pressured ECOWAS countries to impose sanctions on Mali, even when these sanctions did not go to the interests of the African states. Take Senegal, for example, who does a great deal of trade with Mali. They had to follow the sanctions, but they do not benefit from the sanctions themselves.
Well, we'll come on to Africa and Russia, Moscow in a minute. But before I leave the issue of French colonialism, I'm not saying that French imperialism is any better or any worse than any of the other European imperialisms. Indeed, if you were to draw up a league table of morbidity, probably the Belgian colonists were worse even than the French, but the British would take top prize because of the sheer scale of their colonial avarice in Africa. But am I right in saying that of the three that I've just mentioned, and the Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian are no longer of much significance, it is the French that have endured the longest? They continue to cling on in seeking to decide what happens in Africa, who's in power in Africa, what currency they use, what economic policies they follow. Is this because for the French the empire never died? What is it? What's peculiar about French colonialism?
Well, France needs Africa to survive. Without Africa, France will be what they call a third world country. Looking at Niger, a country that produces a huge percentage of the uranium used in the French nuclear industry. Despite Niger producing a lot of what France needs, most of its people are poor. The people working in the mines, the communities there suffer the consequences of mining these radioactive materials, but get no benefits of it. Look at the CFA franc, the colonial currency imposed on the West African countries, where in exchange for independence, these countries had to hold half their foreign reserve holdings in France. and had to take out loans of the money that they stored in France. They had to take loans for their own money. So this is just a few of many examples of how without Africa, France is, another small European country, another Portugal probably.
Now, of course, all the colonialists are deeply disappointed at Africa in its failure to follow the leader, Joe Biden, into the charge of the Light Brigade against Russia. Why is Africa so reluctant to take the American side against Russia and to join in the chorus of hostility towards China and its economic development on the continent?
Yeah, well, the biggest or the most prominent case study is Libya. Africans remember all too clearly what happened with Gaddafi. Libya was okay. Libya did fine. It was the wealthiest country in Africa. And the one organization responsible for that changing was NATO through its assassination of Gaddafi. And it just doesn't stop there. African history with the Russians goes way, way back. We can go back to how Cuban and Soviet forces helped the Angolans push back the apartheid South African forces. We can look at Soviet-Cuban resistance in Ethiopia. There's a whole history of, win-win partnership between Russia and Africa. So that and the fact that the West itself is responsible for a lot of what ails Africa today is what, is giving Africa that clarity that, why should we listen to what our enemy is telling us about their enemy? I mean, Africa can make its own enemies, as Museveni said when Foreign Minister Lavrov visited Uganda a few months ago.
Well, of course, no African, no Russian rather, and no Chinese ever colonized Africa. It's not exactly rocket science. William, thanks for that interview. The audio was not good on my end. I hope the audience could hear you more clearly than I could.